The luxurious street Matthew's Cathedral stood tall against the bright summer sky, its stained glass windows gleaming in the morning sun. Outside, a line of shiny black cars stretched down the street. Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Mercedes, each one dropping off guests dressed in their finest clothes. This wasn't just any wedding. It was being called the society event of the year. A small figure lingered near the massive wooden doors, trying to gather courage. She was a young girl, barely 8 years old, wearing a simple blue dress that had clearly been washed many times. Her dark hair was neatly brushed and tied back with a faded ribbon, and in her trembling hands she clutched an old photograph so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Unlike the wealthy guests streaming past her in their designer outfits and sparkling jewelry, she wasn't supposed to be here. She had slipped in through the back entrance, thanks to her aunt who worked in the catering team. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought it might burst right out of her chest. Through the doors, she could hear the soft music of the string quartet floating out. The wedding was about to begin. The groom was one of the city's most successful tech entrepreneurs, a self-made millionaire whose face often appeared in business magazines. His bride-to-be was even more famous, a celebrity chef whose face was plastered across cookbook covers and cooking shows. The little girl's hand slipped into her dress pocket, touching the crumpled newspaper clipping she had saved. It showed a smiling picture of the bride talking about her secret family recipe that had launched her amazing career. The same recipe that the young girl had watched her own mother make hundreds of times in their tiny kitchen, following instructions written in her grandmother's old notebook. She peeped through the crack in the door. The church was packed with hundreds of people, all turned toward the entrance, waiting for the bride to make her grand appearance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and white flowers decorated every surface. It was like something from a fairy tale, except this fairy tale had a dark secret at its heart. Her mother was lying in a hospital bed across town, getting weaker every day. They couldn't afford the treatment she needed, while the woman who had stolen their family recipe was about to marry into even more wealth. The unfairness of it made the little girl's chest hurt, but it also gave her the courage she needed. She thought about all the mornings she had spent watching her mother bake, creating beautiful cakes and pastries in the small bakery where she worked. Her mother's hands would move with such grace, even when she was tired from working extra shifts. "Our family's recipes are our heritage," she would always say, passed down with love from generation to generation. The wedding march began to play, and the little girl knew it was now or never. Her legs felt like jelly, and her voice wanted to hide somewhere in her throat. But she thought about her mother's pale face in the hospital bed, about the old photograph that proved everything, about the truth that needed to be told. She pushed the heavy door open wider, her shoes making soft sounds on the marble floor. Some people in the back rows turned to look at her, probably wondering why the small girl in her simple dress was walking into such a fancy wedding. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, moving toward the front of the church where the groom stood waiting for his bride. The music swelled, and the main doors began to open for the bride's entrance. The little girl knew she had only seconds left. She squeezed the photograph in her hand one last time, took the biggest breath she could, and shouted words that would change everything. "Stop! She's hiding a shocking secret." The music screeched to a halt. Hundreds of heads turned toward her at once, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had ever experienced. But there was no turning back now. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 years earlier, life had been so different. The little girl lived with her mom in a cozy apartment above Wang's bakery, where the sweet smell of fresh bread and vanilla would wake them up every morning. Their home wasn't fancy, just 2 small rooms with furniture they'd found at yard sales, but it was filled with love and laughter. Every morning, she would sit at their wobbly kitchen table, watching her mom get ready for work. Even though they didn't have much money, her mom always looked elegant in her white baker's uniform, her long black hair neatly tied back. "A baker must always be clean and proper," she would say with a smile, adjusting her name tag in their scratched mirror. The bakery downstairs was like a second home to them. While other kids went to daycare after school, she would sit at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, doing her homework surrounded by the whir of mixers and the clatter of baking pans. Her mom was the head baker, known throughout the neighborhood for creating the most beautiful wedding cakes anyone had ever seen. Sometimes, when business was slow, her mom would teach her their special family recipes. These recipes, she would say, pulling out a worn notebook covered in faded handwriting, came all the way from our hometown in Singapore. Your great-grandmother started writing them down when she was just a girl. The notebook was filled with secrets. Exactly how long to whip the egg whites, the perfect temperature for the sugar syrup, the special blend of spices that made their pastries unique. Her mom had big dreams back then. She would often talk about opening her own bakery someday, showing her daughter sketches of how it would look. "We'll have big glass windows," she would say, drawing with her finger in the flour dusted on the counter, and display cases filled with colorful treats. "People will come from all over the city to taste our special recipes." But life had other plans. It started with little things, her mom feeling tired all the time, needing to sit down more often while decorating cakes. Then came the day when she collapsed at work, right in the middle of piping roses onto a birthday cake. The diagnosis that followed was like a storm cloud that changed everything. The hospital bills started piling up on their kitchen table, next to the recipe notebook. Her mom tried to keep working, but it got harder every day. The other bakers would help when they could, covering her shifts when she had doctor's appointments, or when the treatments made her too sick to stand. The little girl learned to do more around the apartment, washing dishes, folding laundry, making simple meals. She would sit beside her mom's bed, reading cookbooks aloud while her mom rested. Sometimes they would watch cooking shows together on their old TV, and that's when everything changed. One evening, as they watched a famous cooking competition, her mom suddenly sat up straight, pointing at the screen with a shaking finger. There was the lady who was now about to get married, younger then, but still glamorous, talking about a special recipe that had won her the competition. A recipe that sounded exactly like the one written in their family notebook. The little girl remembered how her mom's face had gone pale, how her hands had trembled as she pulled out an old box of photographs from under her bed. That's when she found it. The picture that showed her mom and the famous chef together, both wearing student uniforms at a fancy cooking school in Paris. On the back was a date and words that made her mom cry. "Best friends forever. Our dream starts here." For weeks after that, the little girl watched her mom grow quieter, sadder. The recipe that had won the competition, the one that had launched the famous chef's career and made her millions. It wasn't just similar to their family recipe. It was exactly the same, down to the secret spice blend that her great-grandmother had perfected. Now, standing in that grand church, the photograph burning in her hand like a hot coal, the little girl understood why this moment was so important. This wasn't just about a recipe or money. This was about her family's heritage, about right and wrong, about standing up for what was true, even when your knees were shaking and your voice felt small in a very big room. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning at the hospital. The little girl sat cross-legged on the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her mom's bed, helping to sort through old photographs. The doctors had said it was important for her mom to rest, but lying in bed all day made her restless. So they decided to organize their memories, putting pictures into albums to pass the time. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mixing with the scent of the flowers the bakery staff had brought yesterday. Machines beeped softly in the background as they sorted through the stack of faded photographs, making little piles: family, friends, special occasions. That's when it slipped out from between two Christmas photos, a picture that made her mom gasp and drop the entire stack. The photograph showed two young women, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a famous cooking school in Paris. Both wore crisp white uniforms with the school's logo, their faces bright with excitement and dreams. One was her mom, looking so young and healthy that it made the little girl's heart hurt. The other was the bride from today's wedding. "Mom," she had whispered, picking up the fallen picture. "Is that really you?" Her mom's hands were shaking as she took the photograph. For a long moment, she just stared at it, tears gathering in her eyes. Then, slowly, she turned it over. On the back was a handwritten note: "Spring competition tomorrow. Our special recipe will change everything. Never forget our promise. Best friends forever." That's when the story came pouring out. Her mom and the famous chef had been best friends at cooking school, sharing everything: their dreams, their struggles, their recipes. They had planned to open a bakery together, combining her mom's family recipes with the other woman's business skills. The competition had been their big chance. The prize money would help them start their bakery, and the publicity would bring in customers. They had decided to use her mom's special family recipe, the one that had been passed down through generations, the one that made people close their eyes in delight when they tasted it. But the day before the competition, her mom got terribly sick. "Appendicitis," she explained, touching her side where the scar was. "I had to have emergency surgery. I couldn't compete." Her voice grew quieter. "I told her to use our recipe. I trusted her. She was my best friend." The little girl watched her mom wipe away tears. She won first place. The judges said they'd never tasted anything like it. But when she went on stage, her mom's voice cracked. She said it was her own creation, her family's secret recipe. She took all the credit. After that, everything changed. The famous chef's career took off like a rocket. Magazines wrote about her amazing recipe. She opened fancy restaurants, wrote cookbooks, got her own TV show. Meanwhile, her mom had tried to speak up, but who would believe her? She had no proof. It was her word against a rising stars. The little girl sat there, holding her mom's hand, feeling anger bubble up inside her chest. It wasn't fair. Her mom was the kindest person she knew. She taught other bakers for free, shared her knowledge with anyone who asked, worked extra hours to help customers who couldn't afford fancy cakes. And now she was sick, struggling to pay hospital bills, while the woman who stole their recipe was about to marry a millionaire. Later that night, after her aunt picked her up from the hospital, the little girl couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the photograph, about her mom's tears, about right and wrong. She thought about all the times her mom had told her to always tell the truth, no matter how hard it was. About how one small lie could grow and grow until it hurt people badly. She got out of bed and turned on her little desk lamp. The photograph was still in her jacket pocket. She stared at it for a long time, at the two smiling faces, at the broken promise written on the back. Something had to be done. Someone had to speak up. Even if her voice was small, even if people might not believe her at first, the truth needed to come out. That's when she made her decision. She didn't know exactly how, but she was going to find a way to make things right. She had to, for her mom, for their family, for every person who believed that the truth mattered more than money or fame. The little girl sat at her mom's old laptop, the screen's glow lighting up her determined face in the quiet of their apartment. Her aunt was asleep in the next room, exhausted after her late shift at the catering company. The clock showed 1:30 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on her mind. She began typing into the search engine. Famous chef competition Paris 12 years ago. Her fingers moved slowly. She wasn't as fast at typing as the grown-ups, but she was patient. Page after page appeared, filled with articles and interviews. There it was, a yellowed newspaper article with a familiar face smiling at the cameras, holding up a golden trophy. The headline read, "Rising Star Chef Wins International Competition with Revolutionary Family Recipe." Her heart started beating faster as she read the article. The famous chef described how she'd spent years perfecting the recipe, claiming it was inspired by her grandmother's cooking. But the little girl knew better. She had watched her own mom Make that exact recipe hundreds of times, following instructions written in their family's old notebook. She opened another tab and searched for more recent news. The screen filled with pictures of the famous chef, on magazine covers, hosting TV shows, opening restaurants. In every interview, she talked about her special recipe, how it had made her famous, how it was the foundation of her multimillion-dollar food empire. The girl pulled out her notebook, the one she used for school, and started writing down everything she found. Dates, places, quotes. She knew she needed proof, something more than just her mom's old photograph. But with each article she read, her stomach felt heavier. How could someone lie for so many years? How could they build their whole life on someone else's recipe? She remembered what her teacher had said about doing research projects. Always look for connections. So she dug deeper. She found an old article about the cooking school in Paris, with a tiny picture of the graduating class. There they were, her mom and the famous chef, standing together in the back row. The article mentioned they were business partners, planning to open a bakery together. Her hands were shaking as she wrote this down too. This was proof they knew each other, proof they were friends before everything went wrong. But would it be enough? Would anyone believe an 8-year-old girl over a famous chef? She clicked on a link about the upcoming wedding. The screen filled with pictures of the fancy church, the expensive decorations, the guest list full of important people. The famous chef was smiling in every photo, showing off her diamond ring, talking about her perfect life. Meanwhile, her mom was in a hospital bed, worried about paying for her medicine. The little girl closed her eyes, remembering something her mom always said. The truth isn't always easy, but it's always right. She thought about all the people who bought the famous chef's cookbooks, believing her stories. She thought about her great-grandmother, who had created the original recipe with so much love. She thought about her mom, who had trusted her best friend, only to be betrayed. Opening her eyes, she made a decision. She couldn't let this wedding happen without the truth coming out. But she needed help. Her young mind started forming a plan. Her aunt worked for the catering company handling the wedding. That could be her way in. But she would need more than just the old photograph and some articles. She pulled out her mom's recipe notebook from its special place on the bookshelf. Carefully, she compared the instructions to the famous chef's published recipe. They matched exactly. Every ingredient, every measurement, every special trick. This wasn't just similar. It was the same recipe, word for word. The next morning, before school, she asked her aunt a careful question. If someone steals something, but it's not a thing you can touch, like a recipe, is it still stealing? Her aunt looked at her curiously. Of course it is. Ideas and creations belong to the people who make them. Why do you ask? The little girl took a deep breath. I need to tell you something important, she said, and I need your help to make things right. As she started explaining everything she had discovered, she felt scared but also brave. Sometimes doing the right thing meant taking big risks. Sometimes one small person had to stand up and tell the truth, even when it seemed impossible. And that's exactly what she was going to do. Pieces of the puzzle started falling into place as the little girl dug deeper into her mom's past. She sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, spreading out all her findings. Old magazine clippings, competition photos, and printed articles. Her aunt had helped her make copies of everything, creating what grown-ups called evidence. But what she discovered next made her stomach twist into knots. In an old cooking magazine, she found an interview where the famous chef talked about the recipe's creation. I spent months perfecting it, the chef had claimed, working late into the night in my tiny apartment kitchen. The little girl's hands trembled as she read those words, knowing they weren't true. The recipe hadn't been created in any apartment. It had been passed down through her family for generations. One evening, while helping her aunt prepare catering supplies for another wedding, she overheard 2 kitchen workers talking. Did you hear about the big wedding next month? One whispered. The chef's making her famous dessert for all the guests. They say each serving costs more than what we make in a day. The little girl nearly dropped the napkins she was folding. That dessert, her family's recipe, was being sold for huge amounts of money. Money that could have helped pay for her mom's treatment. Money that rightfully belonged to her family. She waited until they were alone before showing her aunt what she'd found. "Look," she said, pointing to the dates in different articles. "Mom got sick the day before the competition. The next day, she won with our recipe. And a week later, she was on TV talking about her new creation." Her aunt studied the evidence, her face growing serious. "This is bigger than we thought," she said quietly. "That recipe didn't just win a competition. It built an entire business empire." The truth hit harder each day. The famous chef wasn't just using their recipe. She had built her whole career on it. Her restaurants served it as their signature dessert. Her cookbooks featured it as the crown jewel of her collection. Even her TV shows often ended with her demonstrating her special family recipe. One afternoon, the little girl visited her mom in the hospital, bringing her favorite soup from the bakery. As her mom rested, she noticed a magazine someone had left behind. The cover showed the famous chef standing in her newest restaurant, talking about the upcoming wedding. "It will be perfect," the article quoted her saying. "Everything I have, everything I've built. It's all because I followed my dreams and stayed true to myself." Those words made the little girl's heart hurt. How could someone talk about being true to themselves while living a lie? She watched her mom sleeping, looking thin and tired against the white hospital sheets. The unfairness of it all felt like a heavy weight on her small shoulders. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about all the people who believed the famous chef's story. About the wedding guests who would eat their family's special dessert, never knowing its true history. About her mom, who had trusted her best friend, only to lose everything. But new worries started creeping in. What if nobody believed her? What if they just saw a little girl trying to ruin a beautiful wedding? What if the famous chef denied everything? After all, she had been telling this story for 12 years. She had fooled magazines, TV shows, and food critics. Would anyone believe the truth now? The wedding was getting closer, and time was running out. Her aunt had managed to get her on the catering staff list, which would get her into the church. But then what? Standing up in front of hundreds of people, including important business people and celebrities, seemed scarier every time she thought about it. She pulled out the old photograph again, the one showing her mom and the famous chef as young students. They looked so happy, so full of dreams. How had things gone so wrong? How had a friendship turned into such a big lie? Looking at her mom's young, smiling face in the photo, the little girl made up her mind. No matter how scared she felt, no matter how impossible it seemed, she had to try. Because sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. And making things right was more important than being afraid. The week before the wedding brought the darkest days. The little girl stood by the hospital window, watching rain trickle down the glass. Her mom's condition had gotten worse overnight. The doctors spoke in hushed voices outside the room, their faces serious as they looked at charts and test results. "We need to start a new treatment," she heard one doctor say. "But it's expensive." The word expensive seemed to echo down the sterile hallway. Her aunt's face crumpled as she looked at the numbers on the paper they handed her. That same evening, the little girl saw the famous chef on TV again. She was giving a tour of her newest restaurant, pointing proudly at the display case filled with the special dessert, their family's recipe. "We sell hundreds of these every day," she boasted to the camera. "People come from all over the world just to taste it." The little girl's hands balled into fists. Each dessert probably cost more than what they needed for one day of her mom's medicine. She thought about all the money the famous chef had made over the years, all built on their family's recipe. Now her mom couldn't even afford the treatment she desperately needed. Later that night, she overheard her aunt talking on the phone about taking out another loan. "I don't know what else to do. her aunt said, voice cracking. The insurance won't cover it, and we've already borrowed so much. The little girl hugged her worn stuffed rabbit tighter, feeling smaller and more helpless than ever. The next day at the hospital, her mom was too tired to even lift her head. But she still tried to smile when the little girl showed her a drawing she'd made. "Tell me a story," her mom whispered, "like we used to do when you were smaller." Fighting back tears, the little girl began telling a story about a brave princess who fought dragons. But halfway through, she noticed her mom had fallen asleep. The machines beeped steadily in the quiet room. Looking at her mom's pale face, she felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What if she was wrong to plan this? What if speaking up at the wedding only made things worse? The famous chef had powerful friends, expensive lawyers. Who would believe a little girl with just an old photograph and some copied articles? That evening, while helping her aunt clean up after her catering shift, she saw the wedding announcement in the newspaper. The famous chef smiled from the page, standing next to her handsome fiancé. The article called it the wedding of the year and mentioned how the chef would be serving her signature dessert to 500 guests. 500 people, the little girl whispered to herself. 500 people who would taste her great-grandmother's recipe, believing it belonged to someone else. 500 people who would praise the famous chef for her creativity and skill, while her mom lay in a hospital bed, getting weaker each day. She pulled out the old photograph again, the one showing her mom and the famous chef as young students. The edges were worn from how many times she'd held it. Best friends forever, the back still promised. How could someone break a promise so completely? How could they watch their friend suffer and do nothing? That night, she couldn't sleep. She went to the kitchen and pulled out her mom's recipe notebook. The pages were stained with vanilla and butter, marked with little notes in her mom's neat handwriting. "Add extra vanilla," one note said. "Grandmother's secret touch." Sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the little girl felt tears rolling down her cheeks. The wedding was just days away. Once the chef was married to the millionaire, she would become even more powerful, even harder to challenge. The truth would be buried forever under layers of lies and success. Her aunt found her there, still sitting in the dark. Without saying a word, she wrapped the little girl in a warm hug. "Sometimes," her aunt whispered, "when things seem darkest, that's when we need to be bravest." The little girl nodded against her aunt's shoulder. Tomorrow would be another day at the hospital, another day of watching her mom fight to get better, another day of carrying a truth that felt too heavy for her small shoulders. But maybe her aunt was right. Maybe the darkest time was when they needed to find their courage the most. The morning of the wedding arrived with a phone call that changed everything. The little girl was getting ready for her big moment, carefully putting on her blue dress, when her aunt's phone rang. Her aunt's face went pale as she listened to the hospital nurse on the other end. "Your mom's fever has gotten very high," her aunt explained gently, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "The doctors are really worried. They say we should come right away." The little girl felt her world spinning. This was the day she had planned everything around, the day she would finally reveal the truth at the wedding. But now her mom needed her. For a moment, she stood frozen, clutching the old photograph in her hand. Then something clicked inside her mind. This wasn't just about exposing a lie anymore. This was about getting help for her mom before it was too late. The famous chef wasn't just living off their recipe. She was living the life that should have belonged to the both of them, the dream they had planned to share. "We have to go to the wedding first," the little girl said firmly, surprising her aunt. "Mom always says that doing the right thing is more important than being scared. And right now, the right thing is making sure everyone knows the truth so Mom can get the help she needs." Her aunt looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "Sometimes we have to be brave, even when it's hard. But we'll go to the hospital right after, no matter what happens." They drove to the church in silence. The little girl held her evidence folder tightly, the photograph, the competition articles, the copies of her mom's original recipe book. Each bump in the road made her heart jump. What if she failed? What if no one listened? But then she remembered her mom's words from long ago. Our family recipe isn't just about ingredients. It's about love, about sharing joy with others. That's why it's so special. The famous chef had taken that recipe and used it for herself alone, forgetting what it really meant. As they parked behind the church, her aunt, who worked with the catering team, helped her slip in through the kitchen entrance. The place was buzzing with activity. Servers rushed around carrying trays of fancy food. In the corner, she saw it, dozens of their special family dessert, ready to be served to the wedding guests. Looking at those desserts, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about a recipe anymore. It was about right and wrong. About standing up for what you believe in, even when you're scared. About fighting for someone you love. Her aunt gave her a quick hug. "I'll be right here if you need me," she whispered. "Just remember, speak from your heart. The truth has its own power." The little girl nodded, straightening her blue dress. Through the kitchen door, she could hear the wedding music starting. Guests were taking their seats. Soon, the bride would arrive in her expensive white dress, ready to start another chapter in her life built on someone else's dreams. She touched the photograph in her pocket one last time. In it, her mom and the famous chef smiled at the camera, young and full of hopes for the future. They had been best friends once, sharing everything. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a piece of that friend left inside the famous chef's heart. Taking a deep breath, she thought about her mom in the hospital. About all the nights her mom had worked late, trying to save money for treatments. About how, even when she was sick, her mom never lost her kindness or her belief in doing what was right. The wedding march began to play. Through the crack in the door, she could see the groom standing at the altar, smiling. Guests turned in their seats, expecting to see a bride in white. Instead, they were about to see a little girl in a blue dress, carrying nothing but the truth and the courage to speak it. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up and say, "This isn't right." She pushed the door open. It was time. The next few minutes felt like watching a movie in slow motion. As the little girl walked down the aisle, hundreds of surprised faces turned to stare at her. Her blue dress wasn't fancy like the guests' expensive clothes, but she stood straight and tall, holding her folder of evidence close to her chest. "Stop!" Her voice came out stronger than she expected, echoing off the church's high ceiling. "There's something everyone needs to know." The music screeched to a halt, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The famous chef, who had just appeared at the church entrance in her flowing white dress, froze. Their eyes met across the long aisle, and for a moment, the little girl saw something flicker across the chef's face. Recognition, maybe even fear. The groom, a kind-looking man in a black suit, stepped forward. "What's going on?" he asked gently, noticing how small and determined the little girl looked standing there alone. Taking a deep breath, she opened her folder and held up the old photograph. "This is my mom," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "And this is your bride, 12 years ago." They were best friends. They were going to open a bakery together. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The famous chef took a step forward, her face pale beneath her makeup. "This isn't the time," she began, but the little girl continued, her voice clear and steady now. "My mom is in a hospital right now. She's very sick, and we can't afford the treatment she needs." She pulled out the competition article. "The recipe that made you famous, the one that built all your restaurants, it isn't yours. It's my family's recipe, passed down from my great-grandmother." The groom looked at his bride-to-be, confusion written across his face. The famous chef stood frozen, clutching her bouquet so tight the flowers were crushing. "The day before the competition, my mom got very sick. She trusted you with our family recipe because you were her best friend. The little girl's voice cracked slightly. But you took it. You said it was yours. You built everything on that lie. The silence in the church was deafening. Then from the back, her aunt stepped forward, carrying a small box. Inside was their family's original recipe book, the pages yellow with age, stained with years of use. The aunt opened it to the marked page, showing the handwritten recipe that matched exactly what the famous chef had claimed as her own. I can explain. The famous chef started, but looking at the little girl's steady gaze, at the proof in her hands, at the faces of hundreds of guests waiting for the truth, the words seemed to die in her throat. The groom walked over to look at the recipe book. He studied the age pages, the careful handwriting, the dates written in the margins. Then he looked at his bride, waiting for her to deny it. But she couldn't. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. "Did you build your entire career on someone else's recipe?" The famous chef's shoulders slumped, and suddenly she looked very different from the confident woman on magazine covers. I was young," she whispered. "We were both going to use it, but then she got sick, and the opportunity was there, and she stopped, tears running down her face, ruining her perfect makeup." The little girl stepped forward, her voice softer now. "My mom is in a hospital right now. The doctors say she needs special treatment, but we can't afford it. While you became rich and famous with our recipe, she's been getting sicker and sicker." The groom looked at the crying chef, then at the little girl with her folder of evidence and her brave, determined face. He walked over and knelt down to her eye level. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth," he said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what's really important. But it's not too late to make things right." He turned to the guests, who sat in stunned silence. "This wedding is postponed," he announced. "But first, we have something more important to take care of. There's a woman in the hospital who needs help, and it's long overdue." The little girl felt tears roll down her cheeks, but this time they weren't sad tears. Sometimes the truth hurts at first, but it's the only way to heal what's broken. And finally, after 12 long years, healing could begin. 6 months later, the little bakery on Cherry Street was buzzing with life and the sweet smell of fresh pastries. Sunlight streamed through the brand new windows, making the display cases sparkle. Inside, people lined up eagerly, waiting to taste the famous family recipe that had made headlines across the city. Behind the counter, the little girl's mom stood tall and healthy, her cheeks rosy as she arranged perfectly baked treats. The special treatment had worked wonders, paid for by a new business partnership that no one could have imagined on that dramatic wedding day. After the truth came out, the groom had insisted on making things right. Being a successful businessman himself, he saw a way to fix the past and build a better future. Instead of a wedding, that day marked the beginning of something new, a partnership that gave credit and profit where they were due. The famous chef had done something surprising too. After the shock wore off, she made a public announcement admitting everything. She told the world about her mistake, about betraying her best friend, about letting success blind her to what really mattered. It wasn't easy, but telling the truth never is. Now, the little bakery had become something special. The sign above the door read "Two Friends Bakery," and underneath in smaller letters, "Home of the original family recipe." The famous chef and the little girl's mom worked together again, this time as honest partners. Each brought their own talents. One knew business and marketing, the other held the heart and soul of true baking. The little girl loved watching them work together, seeing how they slowly rebuilt their friendship. Sometimes, when they thought no one was looking, they'd laugh about old times in cooking school, their eyes twinkling like they must have done all those years ago. The recipe that had caused so much trouble was now officially credited to its true creators. Every package, every cookbook, every TV show that featured it told the story of a family tradition passed down through generations. And the best part? A portion of every sale went to a special fund, helping other families afford medical treatment. One sunny morning, as the little girl helped arrange cookies in the display case, a young woman came into the shop. She stood nervously, clutching a worn notebook. "I saw your story on TV," she said softly. I I have my grandmother's recipes too, but I was afraid no one would want them." The little girl's mom came out from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. She smiled warmly at the young woman. "Why don't you come have a cup of tea with us? We'd love to hear about your grandmother's recipes." That's how the bakery became more than just a shop. It turned into a place where people shared their family stories and recipes, where traditions were honored and new friendships were made. Every month, they featured a different family's special recipe, telling their story and sharing their heritage. The famous chef changed too. She still appeared on TV shows, but now she talked about the importance of honesty and giving credit where it's due. She started a program teaching young bakers, making sure they knew that success tastes sweetest when it's earned fairly. As for the little girl, she learned something powerful. Sometimes the smallest voice can make the biggest change. Her mom often told customers, "My daughter taught me that being brave isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared." The groom? He never did marry the famous chef, but he became a dear friend to the family. Every Sunday, he'd stop by for coffee and their special dessert, always saying it tasted better now that it was made with honesty and love. One year after that fateful wedding day, the little girl stood in their bustling bakery, watching happy customers enjoy their treats. The photograph that had started it all hung proudly on the wall. Two young women in chef's uniforms, smiling with hope and dreams. But now, beside it hung a new picture. The same two women, older and wiser, standing with a little girl between them, all three smiling at the bright future they'd built together. Sometimes life's sweetest moments come after the hardest choices. And sometimes it takes a child's courage to remind grown-ups about what really matters: truth, friendship, and the special magic of a recipe made with love.